This episode is Asians Read One D&D, episode 58 of the Asians Represent podcast, where my amazing guests, Drew, Jeremy, Michelle, all regulars on Asians Represent, will be talking about the latest One D&D playtest release, or I should say the only One D&D playtest material that's come out. Unearthed Arcana 2022, Character Origins by Jeremy Crawford with Christopher Perkins and Ray Winninger. I'm going to say that. I hope I said that right. If somebody else knows, let me know. But we are going to kind of talk about our first impressions of this playtest material. And we're going to talk about what we liked, what we didn't like. And if we have time, we're going to talk about what we want to see in future iterations of this playtest material. Because, heavy disclaimer, we are fully aware of that fact that this is not going to be the official new D&D product. This is a playtest. So we're just reacting to, what we've read. Now, that said, I think in order to structure this conversation in a manner that's conducive to our limited time frame for today, because we're going to go for just about an hour, I think what we're going to do is we're going to break it down into 4 sections. One, we're going to talk about race, right? The character's origins. We're going to talk about backgrounds, languages, and then rules. Within each one, we'll talk about what we liked, what we didn't like, and we'll kind of go from, we'll kind of move from there. At the end, if we have time, we'll ask folks if they have any questions. If not, what we might do is just do a follow-up stream where we answer people's questions and kind of do a little bit more speculation and some of our own sort of homebrew of this playtest to see, to kind of show what we wanted. So for this particular episode, we're going to focus on, just our impressions, what we liked, what we didn't like. And if we have time, we'll talk about what we want. But if not, we'll do an entire episode on that. Potentially episode 59 or episode 60, because we have an episode, actually, episode 60 is already taken care of because we're talking about anime and the Black community. I'm super excited for that one. We have episode 59 open and episode 61 open. So we'll figure this out. But that said, Michelle, the greatest ceramicist in all of TTRPGs, Drew, the master of the Asians Represent Discord community, and Jeremy, my favorite freelance writer, the only writer on D&D Beyond whose article I will click on every single time. I was going to say other things, but I was like, wait, I can't say those things yet. I was about to say some things, but I was like, I can't say them yet. I also
thought about it.
I know. I was like, can't say that.
You can call me the GM that lets you play as a puppet with a gunblade from now on.
But we can't talk about my character because my characters.
The GM who dares.
Yeah, that's true.
I still feel bad about that. Just to a quick aside, I still feel bad about the final session of that particular campaign because Drew and I were just so fucking disruptive.
It's totally okay. For to clarify for everyone watching, we had a final session of our Pathfinder campaign, and they were up against the big bad, and like shit just hit the fan, and then it like spurted off on everyone, and then everybody just started laughing. Everyone just started laughing. Like it was a great session.
It all started off because we were playing. It was Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and one of the core sort of deities involved was Tabofan. But the entire time we were like, "Oh, Tabofan." If a Cantonese person was saying, "Oh, Tabofan," it's and this is just it just like set us off.
Yeah, there's a lich. There's a lich in like the Pathfinder meta plot called Tarbafon, and we were just like, he's now Cantonese and like just like chilling in his castle, eating dim sum, waiting for the meta plot to advance, and being like, Tarbafon. Like that's how that was.
I have to control myself so badly right now.
Yeah,
if it starts, it's never going to stop.
And then we ended up getting a screenshot of Jeremy saying it with the Cantonese accent, and it broke everyone. Except for Emma. Emma was just like...
Emma, the only decent person in the entire party.
We can share that in the patron chat. We can't share that anywhere else on Discord.
Subscribe to Asians Represent.
Yeah, but that said...
I love Pathfinder. I love Pathfinder, so this ever reprises, like, please let me know.
Oh yeah, no, this my character is fucking awful.
He's a puppet with a gun. Okay,
I'm literally
This is like the most
no.
anime.
So my character, before we get into it, because my character is literally from Tinsha, like the caricature for Pathfinder, and he was like a scientist, and he was experimenting in making the perfect immortal body for the Emperor, and experimenting on himself. And at the pinnacle of his sort of research, his soul was literally shunted out of his body into a puppet, and his body taken away to the west.
Have you been watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventure?
I've never watched JoJo's. Is that from JoJo's?
It's a thing that happens.
I mean, his stand is pretty much like Drew's character, who constantly like is trying to protect him from himself.
So that my character, so he's basically searching for his body, but the more time he spent away from his physical body, his mind becomes more unhinged. And so right now he's basically just Danny DeVito from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but
with a gun
with a gun.
Yeah,
a gunblade.
Like Final Fantasy VIII gunblade. Like literally, that's the thing. So.
So I love my character, but can't play about Asians represent.
No,
we should talk about One D&D. We should.
Well, let's talk about One D&D. This is not the episode where we talk about Pathfinder. Well, actually, no. This is the episode where we talk about Pathfinder, because there are some things in Pathfinder that have come up in all of our conversations about this. So let's dive into One D&D. I want to start with the idea of race. And we could honestly spend the entire sort of episode talking about this, but the One D&D playtest material is broken down into a couple of different sections. Very broadly, races, backgrounds, languages, and then like feats and rules all kind of lump into one. They have made some significant changes in some aspects of 5e D&D, but Wizards of the Coast, based on their current messaging, this could change. Again, this is all speculation. They have said that this will be backwards compatible with 5th edition content. So there are still a lot of similarities between 1D&D, which is supposed to be they're ditching additions, and they're just having, it's just D&D. And they're going to, I suspect they'll keep just iterating on it.
So it's not like Sesame Street with the count where it's like one
D&D. No, it's now it's just there's just a singular D&D
sensation,
and yeah, I don't know. It's essentially it's another edition of D&D, but they're not calling it an edition
to avoid edition wars, which are still happening. Like
and it will still happen because people will say, "Oh, well, I want to do it 5e and I want to do this." It will always happen, and this is I'm curious to see what the objective is right here. But one thing that they haven't changed is the use of the term race. Now, there are a couple of key changes in the 5th edition D&D. I should say the 1 D&D races. The first big change is one that I actually really like, is that they've actually removed the ability score bonuses from them entirely. They've moved them over to backgrounds, and we'll talk about that later. But they've removed a lot of that particular mechanical component of the races that were in 5e. Each of the races obviously has a creature type, which is supposed to be humanoid. They actually have some variations in size now, which I think is cool. Speed, lifespan, and then they have like special traits and special abilities for each one. What they've also included here are, I guess, a hard-coded set of rules, and it's not my place to talk about it, but two of you are great for this, and you've talked about this before on the podcast, is they've put hard-coded rules on how to do mixed-race characters. Now, I see two main discussion topics within the 1 D&D races section. One is, the removal of the ability scores. Maybe three things. One is the removal of the ability score bonuses. Two is the use of the term race, the continued use of the term race. And three is obviously the rules and the wording behind mixed race characters and making mixed race characters. Now, I think the easy one to kind of cross off of our list is obviously ability score increases. Like, my initial reaction was, oh, this is great. I was happy with that. I don't know about you folks.
In general, I think the whole tying ability scores with backgrounds is fine. It's been
Mhm.
talked about a lot in the D&D community, and I think it's pretty much giving people what they've been calling for a long time. I think how they handle the build your own background section and the template backgrounds that they provided is something we can talk about later on in this chat. But generally, I do like how ability scores are no longer necessarily tied to race, which is you had no choice in normal 5e but to deal with that unless you were playing with Tasha's rules, which have sort of
Yep.
kind of become the norm in D&D now. Kind of an example of kind of a mid-edition update that was perhaps foreshadowing what we see now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and they mentioned the Tasha's rules actually in this document. So in Tasha's, for those of you who don't have the book, it says if you'd like your character to follow their own path, you may ignore your ability score increase rate and assign ability score increases tailored to your character. Um, for me, honestly, I would have just loved that for One D&D. That's the rule. That's what you do. Um, but what about you, Michelle? What are your
I mean,
thoughts on this?
I agree. I think there are some. It makes sense. It makes sense because there is unfortunately a very long history of making certain assumptions about people that in real life because they are of a certain background, of a certain ancestry. I am happy to see that ancestry is a word that's being incorporated into this edition, but I think it just makes sense that if you're going to have in some ways a I feel like in a way you're building your resume with this particular kind of structure. And this is essentially but choosing a background but basically becomes a way to sort of explain the skills in your resume. There are certain things in particular about that we can talk about as we get diving in a little bit deeper into backgrounds that I think are definitely like question mark. Is that really the correct move here?
Yeah,
Particularly when it comes to languages. But that being said, I do appreciate the fact that, for example, like acolyte +2 wisdom +1 intelligence, that makes sense. Um, of course, I think this is a really great start. I would love to see that fleshed out a little bit.
I completely agree. Yeah. What
Yeah.
about you, Drew? Do you agree? Is there anything you would add?
Um, I think that having ability scores tied, certain ones tied to certain professions or certain backgrounds is, while not necessarily as damaging as attaching it to a concept of a race or species, still can add this element of like, well, all people of this job or this profession or this background, because not all of them are like your job,
Hmm.
Hmm.
some of them are just the way you were raised, which is also kind of confusing.
Yeah,
Because
I agree.
like not all of them are, not all of them are jobs, but like it's still making presumptions on what those people are like. But when we look at various things like, let's take a gladiator for instance. In ancient Rome, there were a number of different gladiators that were almost like classes. You had a specific kind of style that you fought in, and not all of them relied on having uh, charisma and strength as much as some others did. So while that's a really tame version of that issue, um, I just think having a free floating, you get a +2 and a +1, do whatever you want. I feel like is the best like answer to the issue. I think this is better, but it's not. I'd like to see them just kind of push it to the end goal, in my opinion.
Well, they
Yeah.
kind of do that with the build your background thing, which I think
Yeah.
is what they're trying to push as the kind of the core of backgrounds. I think the templates provided, which is, I mean, it's not exactly clear in the playtest document, but the templates provided are just supposed to be potential options for you to base, your
Hmm.
customizable background on. But yeah, I mean, I think they do seem to be moving away completely from the idea that, oh, you're a dwarf, you get like a bonus to your constitution, or you're an orc and you get a minus to your intelligence, stuff
Hmm.
like that. Like,
Oh, yeah.
I don't think we'll ever see that again.
Yeah,
No, they didn't
I'm-
have penalties in 5e. They're like
They did.
They did for orc.
Oh, they did for
the-
orc. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
That,
They did
that,
for
that, that was what kicked this whole thing off in 2020. Volo's
Yeah,
Guide
that's
to
right.
Monsters, the orcs. And I mean, orcs are finally a
I
core.
banished that from my memory.
Orcs are finally going to be a core race in the player's handbook, and I like that. I think it's about time. Although,
Mhm.
I mean, it remains.
Though the execution.
Yeah, the execution possibly has some things attached to it that we might want to talk about.
I mean,
Yeah,
while
for
we're
sure.
on it, why don't we talk about that? Because in our chat, when we were, sort of organizing this, you mentioned that the first thing you said, you were like, "Whoa, orcs are like a core race now in this." For me,
Yeah.
I think I thought it was cool that they did that, but in execution, there's stuff that I don't like because they still lean in on that, like, we're just here to fight shit.
Yeah, they have an ability called Adrenaline Rush. They have powerful build. It's still leaning on the idea that orcs in general are big and bulky, and the lore that they have here still connects them with, their one-eyed god. So they have a warrior lineage, and I don't think we're ever going to completely get away from that as long as D&D sticks with its pre-existing lore and encourages the idea of differentiating races by these sort of abilities that you can't really pick and choose from. If you play an orc according to these playtest rules, you're going to have the adrenaline rush. You can't possibly swap it for something else, or you're going to have relentless endurance. And I think, yeah, like we can definitely poke holes in that and say that, well, you shouldn't presume to say that all orcs necessarily are going to have a powerful build or are going to be able to take the dash action as a bonus action. But I think it's sort of a flaw in the fact that D&D presents these races. They present them with these positives and these negatives in some way that are now, removed from the ability score increases, but are now kind of hard coded in some of the abilities that you have to choose from when you pick that particular race.
And that is something that we have discussed on Karator as well. Just the fact that there is, and I mean, this was discussed. This was kind of brought up during the big WotC announcement that happened, I think, about a week ago or so. The fact that there is this very large amount of lore, the Dragonlance novels, as well as other sources that were written in a different time, and as One D&D emerges, it's going to be interesting to see how they decide to incorporate that information, given, I guess, all the people who are so heavily invested within that setting. And so, yeah, I do agree. I feel like it just kind of makes me uncomfortable to have less of a, and I know that you could, for example, create this you can choose like an orc build where you can then add on various feats and backgrounds in order to create like a very non-stereotypical orc. But the fact that there is still like
The
that
default.
stereotype there, is not great.
Yeah, so if you're a first time player and this is the edition that you pick up, that's what you're going to see, right? Yeah, and I think the safe thing goes, I think at the root of that all is how they are communicating these design choices, their wording, right? There are aspects of this that I think are just in general a little odd, because they're binding themselves to these game mechanics. One thing that, and I think this is just me nitpicking, this is the most nitpicky I got when I was looking at it, and they would say when two dragonborns whose scales are different colors produce a child, their offspring scales match those of one parent or the other. And I was like, what?
I saw that that's not how.
Well, I think the entire way.
I get why, because they're like, oh, well, the scales are tied to the the damage type, and that's where the mechanics are kind of holding them back. But for me, it's like I would just say that I've got these this mixed color, or my scales all are different colors, or I have patterns on my scales or whatnot.
It definitely breaks it the diegenic sort of understanding within this new edition that if you are of a mixed heritage, even within Dragonborn, if you're a mixed heritage within like any other combination, you have traits of both. But if you're a Dragonborn, it's like an amethyst Dragonborn with a sapphire Dragonborn, you're not gonna have like, I don't know, a random emerald. Like that's just I don't know. I feel really weird about that. I also noted that in my in
Okay,
my
I wasn't
notes.
the only one.
I was
And
just
I
like,
mean,
that seems weird.
that takes us to the most contentious like part of this, and it's the children of different humanoid kinds. First of all, it's a very wordy subsection. Um, like Drew and Jeremy, I think you have a different perspective here than I do.
I don't like it.
There we go.
I
Let's move
like
on.
it.
This is,
I mean-
this is, yeah, it's pretty bad.
So,
But not, they didn't intentionally try to be bad, but to me it comes across as very like fetishizing mixed
White person
race.
effort.
Yeah,
like,
it's,
sure.
it's
we're
very,
trying.
I don't want to say this, but it feels very like white liberal, like I voted for Obama. Like look at how we're presenting the beautiful
Mhm.
unions between different humanoids. It comes like previously in D&D you often had, you know, orcs being stereotyped, or half orcs and half elves being stereotyped, and now I think you have them fetishized in a way with this particular with the copy that they've chosen to present here. But yeah, I'll let Drew go first.
yeah, I think it's an overcompensation for criticisms, perhaps both internally within WotC as well as externally from people like many of us, where it's the various racist depictions of different D&D peoples and whatnot is real bad, and it's very negatively racist. Not that there's real positively racist, but I'll get to that in a second. Like, and it's the overcompensation of like, well, we want to make sure that it's not presented as a bad thing, therefore we shall present it as a really too good of a thing. It's to
Wondrous
cover the
pairing.
basis.
Magical
instead of hitting
workings
the
of
mark,
multiverse.
yeah, instead of hitting the mark, they just kind of blew past it into, I guess, toxically positive racism. Where instead of being, you're a half blood character that is not accepted by either of your parents or your societies, and you have no place in the world. And now instead, you have the other side of that coin, which is you are the one that will unite everyone. You are emboldened with
You are
by
the
fate
arbiter.
and by the gods to be the arbiter, and to bring all these divided peoples together. Like you are some chosen one because you happen to be born to parents of different peoples.
Yeah, because your
And that's-
existence is struggle, according
I
to
mean,
this.
Yeah,
I don't think this stuff will survive the playtest. I definitely think it's going
Me
to be
too.
changed, because
I
even
hope not.
a lot of people have picked up on this. But I think there is a very real world sort of ongoing problem with how mixed race people are often fetishized in media, where they're like, oh, build your own ideal race, where it's like you have the eyes of like an Asian person,
It's a
the
eugenics
skin of like a
situation.
white
It's a
person.
eugenics. It's
It's
mechanized
a
eugenics.
It's mechanized eugenics even more than what was present in 5e before, but simply because of the language they've used. Mix and match visual characteristics, choose the wondrous parents that have created this magical workings of the multiverse union. I mean, you don't need all that. Just say that you can have parents from different races, and you might look like this or you might look like this, but that doesn't necessarily define your path in life.
It's exactly
Yeah.
how I feel. For me, it was like when I first read it, I was like, oh, there's some promising stuff here. They're actually having a conversation. And then when I tweeted that, people started like DMing me, being like, I'm disappointed in you, Daniel. And I'm like, I said it's promising, not that it's good. Like, like I like some things. There are some things that I like, and I like that the game rules are now encouraging people to have conversations and control over their parentage. I think that is good. The execution of it is bad, right?
I mean, I think it needs a rewording, basically.
It needs a rewording for
a lot of
Yeah,
this. Yeah, a lot of this can be fixed.
I actually wrote like a ton of like suggestions about like
Let's hear it.
how, I mean, basically just like ancestry. I mean, we've seen this before with the wonderful like Ancestry 5e like supplement that came out and is so great, and I am an idiot and forgot to research who wrote it, because it's really, really fantastic. But speaking of things like, again, it really does speak to, like, as Jeremy is saying, someone who saw Hamilton 3 times and really loves rapping it. Is, yeah, I'm
Arcanist Press,
thinking,
Ancestry and Culture. Arcanist Press.
thank you. I'm specifically thinking of
Oh,
that.
I
the
worked on
opening
that.
of-
Sorry, I wasn't even.
Daniel.
I'm sorry.
Daniel.
You had me at a
Daniel.
Hamilton, and I was just like,
Yeah.
well,
Back to
think it's-
Hamilton.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Back to Hamilton. I was specifically thinking of that scene in Knives Out, the very, very beginning. If anyone has seen it,
yeah.
He's like, yeah, I've seen Hamilton like 3 times. I'm not racist, and it's like, my dude.
That's the new. Oh, I have a black friend. That's the new one.
It's a new. I've seen Hamilton. Much more.
I like Chinese food. I can't possibly be
I can use
racist.
chopsticks. But
yeah.
the things.
I mean, I think this. Sorry. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I was just thinking like things I suggested were like mixed heritage. Why not lean into ancestry? Why not lean into heritage and ancestry, which are 2 different things that I think could be a big thing that could save this entire section, right? And especially the just taking out these overly dramatic adjectives like fantastical and, like we said, wondrous, and just like and portraying this almost oh gosh, like
Make it feel grounded.
Romeo and I was about to say it feels this very romanticized understanding. Very, I'm almost thinking of like a very. It's because it sounds almost Shakespearean, right? The way they
Star-crossed
describe
lovers. Yeah, it's like
star-crossed lovers.
Yeah.
Ah, yes.
The orc is Romeo, the elf is Juliet. I mean,
we should get that.
But
with
that sort of fantastical writing, it's like that over embellishment is seen throughout the entire document. Like for me, I messaged you folks because this part just threw me off. Because in the elf section, they're like, oh, elves have the mystical ability to take on characteristics of the environment with which they bonded.
I mean, there's that, but
that's just
but
the natural world.
Yeah, that's just how the world works. That's just how living in a place works.
That's how evolution works.
Like I've lived in Boston for like a year, and yes, I have adapted to living here by going to REI and getting a coat. But like,
are you adapting to the sea air?
I'm adapting to the Boston sea air. I'm adapting to the scent of Wahlburger. Every time I walk outside.
Fuck Mark Wahlberg.
Yeah, no kidding.
Fuck that guy.
But it even though the language is so florid, it hits so weirdly here, specifically in what they would call race. And I think there's also just a conversation to be had about like, is race really the correct word we should be using? I understand that there is, a fine line to be walked between wanting to be accurate, but also wanting to make sure that for lack of a better word, the people you're creating are humanized and have like an actual grounding in real world empathy and things like that. And I think that's so it's just like there's just a lot here that I feel needs to be pondered over in a lot of ways, but particularly towards ideas of like how we see ourselves and how we see like character creation in this particular way as a reflection of ourselves.
Yeah, I think, when I put out that tweet, I was actually really surprised at some of the responses to that tweet. So I put out a tweet basically saying, okay, well, what are we going to do if we don't use race, right? I said, here are like my suggestions. This is what I was like pondering, right? I said, well, Pathfinder 2nd edition uses ancestry, which I really like. I really like that. But what about
heritage?
Ancestry and heritage, right?
Yeah,
and what about lineage, heritage? They use the word origin here. And for me, like, obviously lineage is actually already used in D&D. So I get why they would keep lineage as like your sub-race, right? But we don't need race. And I get why they did it, because they want that sort of terminology continuity between 5e and 1D&D. I get it. But I think everyone knows what you mean.
I mean, they say Jeremy Crawford says
they say ancestry.
Yeah, race is your ancestry. So I would encourage them to drop the term, because ancestry is sort of being pushed as the new term to use. Even Tal'Dorei Reborn, which is in 5e, that book started using ancestry. And this is kind of related to a bigger idea I have, which is I think the effort to make 1D&D backwards compatible is possibly going to be limiting in some ways like this. Like, the only reason they're sticking with race as a term is to maintain continuity.
Yeah.
the 2014 edition of the game. But the final version of the product is going to be quite different from that 2014 version, and maybe the adventures are going to be semi-backwards compatible if you fix a couple things. But at the same time, I mean, we have different ways of establishing a character already with the Tasha's rules. I feel like now is a perfect time to just say, okay, we're not going to call it race anymore. Just call it ancestry. That's quickly becoming, the new language. And, it has its own issues, but it's better than race.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. I like ancestry. They use the word here. The one thing that I really dislike, and I get a visceral reaction when people bring it, is like species. I really
Species
dislike that.
is a very specific
It's also
word.
so loaded if you're talking about species like a scientific term, that it means a
It's
lot of what we're doing here is impossible.
yeah, no, it has a time and a place, and that's within
This is
a
not it.
textbook that is devoted to, say, the study of frogs. Like,
Well, yeah, if
it
you're
is,
talking
it
about the
has
biological concept of species, that does not work in D&D.
no, 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 it doesn't. One is it's a very real world scientific term that does not have a place here. Like, that is my argument in terms of species, because like that it's just, it doesn't belong here. It has a very clear, and not only that, again, we get to like the eugenics conversation,
Exactly.
right? So there's really no call for
Species
in
is
my
the
opinion.
poorest, is one of the poorest choices you can make to replace race. Ancestry, I think that's a great one. I would also be fine with, origin, right?
Because we're creating people.
Yeah,
Like,
and
we
this
are
was actually a
making
conversation
people.
that we had when
Yeah.
working on Motherlands. It was like, what terms are we going to use? And what if you were raised, because I don't know the lore of Motherlands, and that was my like selling, like when Tanya asked if I would work on this, and I was like, I don't know about Motherlands. Tanya was like, you don't need to, and I was like, cool, that's my advantage, I guess. I don't know anything. I'm unbiased. But I was like, so well, like, what if you were like a human like me, but raised by robot people? What if I wanted to have their culture, right? Because we had to talk about culture. Culture is a term that we use in Motherlands. And it was like, yeah, if I was raised by robo people, maybe I would wear pieces of armor on my body. And that's how the culture might manifest in my character. But we don't have to have these bonuses, these numbers, right? It's the same thing with D&D. I like the fact that you could say, use ancestry and have elements of, in your narrative of, being raised amongst another group of humanoids, right? What if I was a halfling raised by, let's go in terms of extremes, raised by orcs, right? Would that mean that I haven't trained my body to have, that, the abilities that they have? Would I have that adrenaline rush? Would I have that relentless endurance because I've trained my body? And I mean, there's a whole talk about backgrounds and feats as well, because some of these things I think should honestly be feats. But I think for the sake of time, what we've kind of settled on is that they've kept race purely for backwards compatibility. And really the better term should be ancestry plus lineage, and used there. Another thing that they have here is this. They have positive intent with what they're trying to do, particularly with having mixed race characters, like you've said, Drew and Jeremy. The intent is there. You could see that they're trying, but the execution is so goddamn poor. And what they really need to do is have a lot of these ancestry, race, we'll use race because that's what they use in this document, have a lot of the information that they're saying, or a lot of the information that they're presenting about race, have grounded descriptions rather than fantastical embellishments, which actually tend to hurt this more. Would you agree? Would you folks agree? I think that's kind of like our
Yeah.
summary of this section.
Yeah. Because, as I've said already, we're talking about people.
Yeah.
We're making
And I know they're trying
people.
to stress the multiverse in this upcoming iteration of D&D. I'm not calling it an edition. They're definitely stressing the multiverse. There's a bunch of talk of sigil in here, like all humans come from sigil. There's a lot of interesting things here that might point to the fact that they are de-emphasizing the Forgotten Realms and want to stress some sort of hub world setting, probably Planescape or something of that nature that is going to kind of incorporate, your homebrew worlds, critical roles worlds, like stuff like that. So
I personally
think
would have just loved it if they didn't have that setting stuff in these descriptions
Yeah,
for races.
I get the impression that a lot of this mystical multiverse mentioning is probably because that's the direction D&D is going over the next year, over the next 2 years. So hopefully,
Yeah.
once the time this comes out, that'll get they won't have to push that as much. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. So let's think about let's move on from this race section, because I think we can do a whole episode on it. And if you folks are really interested in learning more and hearing more from Drew and Jeremy, you could check out episodes 50 and 43 of the Asians Represent podcast, which were both multi-hour episodes about mixed race representation in D&D and fantasy, and how to make mixed race characters. One thing I did notice, and it's something that I learned from those panels, is that sort of I know Legal Kimchi brought this up, is that tragic mulatto trope. And they actually built that kind of in here, because in the tiefling section, before we move on to backgrounds, because it's literally the last thing you read before backgrounds, is they say, thanks to the victories and sacrifice of these legends, these tieflings in the past, tieflings are now accepted because their ancestors suffered for them. And people recognize them as, oh, you're not a bad person.
Yeah, the tieflings lore needs some.
The tiefling lore needs to be fixed. And this is why I think divorcing it from the lore is the right thing to do, because you could make these really clear, really concise, and give the freedom to the players. And so you see that with games like Fellowship. It's not D&D, but in Fellowship, each player is the representative of their people. And so you make the decisions about your people, which I think is cool. I realize that doesn't work fully in practice with D&D, but I like it as a concept. Now, that said, a huge change made to One D&D were the backgrounds. Previously in 5e D&D, backgrounds were kind of like pretty skippable. A lot of people skip them. Some of them have some really good things, and you'd pick it for that reason. I mean, like Acolyte in 5e has a pretty solid feature there. Or like Urchin had like city secrets, and you can like find your way around a city really well. But other than a couple of those little things, backgrounds were pretty forgettable in 5e. But now what they've done with backgrounds is they've really expanded them. They've not only provided, like you've mentioned, Jeremy, rules for building your own background, but they've moved ability scores to them. And they've really fleshed them out a lot more, because you also get a feat with your background as well. And feats are another conversation that we'll have in this episode. But thoughts on backgrounds? Mine were extremely mixed. I really liked some things, and I really hated a lot more things.
Yeah. I like the I basically like how they made backgrounds crunchier. Like I like the crunchiness of backgrounds, and I like the addition of feats to backgrounds. I like the new addition of level 1 feats. A lot of this is kind of, I mean, you can draw a lot of comparisons with Pathfinder. Like this is basically what Pathfinder does, and I think, or the second edition Pathfinder, I think there is probably, there might have been some looking at that system and kind of some figuring out of how to bring backgrounds a bit more to the forefront, because a lot of 5e backgrounds are really just you get proficiencies in 2 skills, or you get proficiency with like a gaming set. And I think, I think back to a funny conversation we had in our Pathfinder game, Daniel, where you were like, we were talking about how a lot of high level D&D abilities just kind of just give you advantage, and you were like, I don't want advantage, I want a plus 20 to hit.
Just give me here. This is for me the biggest example of that is the difference between True Strike across editions of D&D.
And I don't think we'll ever see D&D dealing with such high modifiers again, but I like the idea of how with backgrounds they're kind of implementing a little bit more crunch to them.
I actually think this version of D&D hurts high modifiers.
Yeah, it absolutely does.
It really hurts high level play.
Yeah, it does. But that aside, and I'm sure everybody else is going to bring this up as well, the sort of build your own background or follow the templates we have here, where gladiator makes you speak orc, and like I think farmer makes you speak halfling. The examples need
are so bad.
Yeah, the examples need to be revised a little bit as well. And I also fear that making build your own background the default might put a little bit more burden on the DM who's trying to teach a bunch of new players how to play the game, because in my opinion 5e it puts a lot of burden on the dungeon master in general to make things up, or to kind of create subsystems when the actual rule sets don't really provide you with that sort of thing. And so I just worry that might happen a little bit here. It remains to be seen whether that will
That's what
actually
happens,
be the case.
though. That's what happens when you go rules light for a game that has this inherent power dynamic.
Yeah,
like whether or not you want to frame the GM as an equal, the GM
that's
has
a bigger
more
issue.
power.
That's a bigger issue.
That's a bigger issue. D&D. I personally, I would just love. I just like the way Tasha's does the ability scores. Just like, hey, just pick them. But for this one, the one thing I like, obviously, the skill proficiencies, the tool proficiencies is great. The ability scores is better here. So I'll say that's a bonus to the backgrounds part. I fucking hate the language part. I hate it so much. And just whoever, and I don't want to hate on the folks at WotC who worked on this, but the backgrounds part, it feels like this is where the most oversight existed, happened. They made the mistake with the racist section, but this part is just bad. In my opinion, it's cool that you get a feat. It's cool that there's a template for how much equipment you get and that you get your ability scores. But it doesn't make sense to me that when we were joking about this earlier, that I'm a sailor. I did one tour at the sea. Now I can speak to all elementals. It doesn't make any sense. Or I'm a farmer. I'm a potato farmer. And for the soul, and because of that, I speak halfling. That just means all farmers speak halfling because in their lore they said halflings love farming.
I mean, a way to fix this would have been to emphasize that these are just examples, and instead of just saying sailor, be like sailor in the elemental planes or something like that. Zero them in.
Just suggestions,
or suggestions, or
the 3.
How about this one? It's just laborer. What laborer? But then all the text is about masonry. Just call it a mason. That's your sample. It's a mason. It's not a laborer.
I mean, this is carried over obviously from previous editions, but and I think we may have mentioned it before, but I really wish they would decide whether a background is a former profession or just the way you grew up. I understand that
they have to differentiate class and background much clearer.
Yeah, they need to do that because this is for example, like we talked about earlier, urchin. Yes, but urchin is not a profession.
Precisely. I'm a professional urchin. What are you talking about?
I'm a professional urchin.
I understand. I know that the Charles Dickens stands are going to come hardcore after me for this, but I'm just saying.
We just pissed off a whole new category of
Oliver Twist fanboys coming after us. Yeah.
All the Oliver Twist fan cams on Twitter.
All of the Artful Dodger fans are just going to come after us.
I'm glad you're modding the chat right now, Drew. I'm glad you're here because I'm.
Yeah.
Get ready to ban some.
All those Dickens fans,
Oliver Twist fans.
But yeah, there's just, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and I think also that some of these are just stronger than others, in terms of what they're trying to flesh out. For example, I really like there's and also there's some I guess not. I don't necessarily like it. For example, I think we talked about the gladiator, and there's a little bit of world building in here that's just wait, where was this?
The world building for the gladiator is awful because it's oh yeah, you're a pit fighter and you speak orc, so it's let's just reinforce that whole thing. Yeah. Orcish is the language of the pit fighters.
I think that background should be renamed Homie of the Orc Gladiator. That would be a better background.
Sure.
I mean, the thing though is they really need to just decide where these things should go. I just sorry, I had a point and then it left me as I was considering another thing. But it needs to be tied, I think, a little bit more carefully to region, right? That says, for example, a farmer is going to know halfling, or an artisan is going to know gnomish.
A soldier is going to know goblin for some reason.
Because they're circling. This is the part where the lore comes in. It's oh yeah, you're a soldier. The Goblin Wars.
This is the part we're trying to fix. The lore is they're trying to make goblins. They're trying to reduce the stereotypes about goblins. You study the strategies of goblinoid generals.
Okay, sorry. For example, if you're a drow farmer, how the hell would you know halfling?
Because you're a farmer.
How?
That's what this is telling you.
But you're like in the Underdark.
Well, that's the thing, because they were basically I think they took. They had a bunch of post-it notes on the wall, and they were like, okay, language. Where are we gonna put this? Let's put it under background, right? And here's the thing: if we remove language from background, okay, that's one less thing that makes background useful. We remove ability scores from backgrounds. That's another thing that makes backgrounds even more forgettable, right? And all you're really left with is something interesting, and that's the feat, right? And the background gives you that free feat, when you make your character. I think that you're right. I think there needs to be a reevaluation of where the background actually fits in a character's identity, both mechanically and narratively, right?
Yeah.
Because having a language here is just
It makes
weird.
no sense. It's not correlating to reality because, like, so like I'm a ceramicist / artist. Yes, I know.
You speak
things.
Gnomish?
I don't speak Gnomish, but like it's like in the real world there are, for example, Italian things like that you would like or if you're a chef, for example, you would know like the names of a lot of different dishes in Italian or whatnot, but it doesn't mean that I know Italian. It just means I know like the difference between Mafaldi pasta and orecchiette. Like
my first instinct was, oh, you spent your summer in Tokyo. Sorry, that was like that was the first thing.
Even outside of like comparisons to reality, if their goal truly is to create this sense of there being a multiverse, that all these different D&D campaigns, whether they be public streamed games or their Adventurers League or they are at home homebrew worlds and things like that, it's counterintuitive. The more specific things you start saying in these suggestions, the more they just become reality in people's minds.
You start reinforcing these stereotypes.
Yeah, and it is one thing, like for myself, when I read this stuff, I ignore half of this. Like, but for one of me that ignores almost all the flavor text of things, there are hundreds of people who want that stuff and they want it to make sense and they want to kind of fall in love with those realms. But when you read this, you're reading, like, are you reading Eberron? Are you reading, Spelljammer? Are you like, what are you reading right now?
All nobles and all in the entire multiverse have to go to Draconic Kumon, basically.
Yeah.
It's basically what they said here.
Yeah,
I think just to justify the fact that, oh, this is a noble language.
Yeah,
right. It's wild.
It's counterintuitive to reality, but it's also counterintuitive to the goals of WotC as they seem. Right. It just doesn't make sense, and it does, I think, the opposite. Of those things, because I am not going to read this and take that as the reality, but many will, and that's just the lore. Or they have players that have no clue. Let's say I'm running a game, brand new homebrew little nation that I'm running stuff in, and you have not experienced any of it yet. All you have to go off of is the player's handbook and whatever they say, because I can't cover all these bases at the same time.
That's why this is so important to discuss, right? Because you are setting the foundation for all of the games people are going to play. Like, another one for me is like, I think, Michelle, we were talking about this, and it was like the fact that, I think this is one of the worst ones, the fact that the urchin, your language is common sign language. Michelle, you're muted. I'll listen.
No. I'm not. I mean, I just don't feel like blowing up my mic.
Yeah, common sign language. First of all, it doesn't make sense. It plays into those just like terrible stereotypes of the fact that, first of all, that deaf people can't get jobs, which is an awful stereotype, and it's 100% untrue. But they're feeding into this. It's like, oh yeah, anyone who grew up on the streets, they speak common sign language in addition to common. And it's
also like I don't know, to me, same with common sign language. I think I understand what the thought process might have been,
just make it
in terms
make
of
a thieves'
doing
camp.
that. Like, I get this idea of like, you're a bunch of rascals and the guard's standing there, so you just make some rude gestures and that makes sense to your friend. I think that's probably what they're thinking, in the same way that they are probably thinking that the feat lucky given to someone who is impoverished and down on their luck,
Yep.
it is probably trying to evoke some sense of like Aladdin. You have this charming urchin guy that just kind of gets away with things, but Aladdin's Aladdin and not characteristic of every other person in his tax bracket, like,
And it's like every single urchin's got their gaming set, like they're ready to duel on the streets.
yeah, it
yeah,
just doesn't make
I
it just doesn't
remember
make
that.
sense.
I remember
I
that
mean-
chapter in Oliver Twist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a classic example of trying to be inclusive by including common sign language as a prominent part of the playtest.
It's performative wokeness.
Yeah,
That's
but
what
not
that is.
but not really thinking about how this would come across. And I think we can see the same thing in how they presented the mixed race rules. It's obviously this stuff is going to get changed. This is definitely what the playtest is for. But I think it's I mean, once again, like you said, Daniel, don't want to criticize the people that worked on this, but I definitely feel that these rules could have used a few more eyes. I don't know if they had the entire WotC design staff looking at it. Like I don't exactly know how many passes it went through, but it definitely. I feel like you could have gotten a couple mixed race people to look at the children of different humanoid kinds section, and they probably could have told you what Drew and I have been saying. And I have a feeling
what they're getting here is free consultation from the public.
What they're getting is free consultation from the public, but it would, it would make me feel better to know if there were already people at WotC who could do this.
For me, it feels disappointing that this is the first thing, even though I understand, again, caveat, this is a playtest, caveat, this is we're essentially dog fooding it, and I understand that, but these are not difficult things to pick up on. I know there are people inside the building who would have looked at this and just been like, nah, and then it would have freed up so much of our time to talk about more insightful, more like deeper ideas and deeper suggestions. I think that would have been a little bit more considerate, honestly. But I get it. I understand. We don't know. We have 3 names at the top of people who say who probably have definitely worked on this, but it does feel like a really poor first showing, especially considering the hype that's been built around this, especially given
They did a whole event.
They had a whole freaking event. There was actually a lot of just magic being like, buy all of this, but that's another thing. However, I just think that in the vein of all the previous releases, especially with Tasha, this feels a lot of a letdown. I don't know. Then again, maybe again we're just we're not judging this correctly. Maybe I'm not judging this correctly. I am comparing a finished product to essentially something that somebody may have typed up at 4 a.m. with a bunch of other people that typed it up at 4 a.m.
Here's the thing, though. There's a lot at stake with this, though, because if people weren't being overly critical, this stuff is going to make it into that final product. And then the conversation we'd be having on this podcast would be completely different, right? So I think it's good to be overly critical of this, because if I was a designer, I would want that. I would want people to tell me, what they think should be improved, right? Now, obviously, you're also right that they also made a very poor first impression of this. I think, again, there's promise, but there is a lot of poor execution. There's promise here.
I think it's a case of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, where I think we are trending towards progress, positive progress. I think we are moving our way, even though it feels, very slow and lumbering to get there. I think we're making our way forward in a way that is good, but at the same time, as things improve, the things that are not improving are going to feel that much worse. Because they start to become glaring. When it's something when it's something like Karator, you know,
Okay.
that is like an assault on the senses, you know. No individual thing feels that bad because it's all just terrible, you
Just
know.
a cacophony of ridiculous racist
Yeah.
racist
Yeah,
nonsense.
but in this case where it's like, you know, at least to my impressions, where I like, you know, I'd say like 70% of everything, the 30% feels worse because I notice it more, you know, because it's glaring at me from the page. Um, Also, not to be a not too much of an aside, did you know that the urchin has like the third most gold in the backgrounds?
Because you're a thief. Because you're a
You
thief.
stole it? Like
yeah, you
all
took it
That's what they say. That's what they're saying there.
with your dimples, your cheeky little dimples.
I just we should move on for the sake of time. Now I know Michelle and Drew, you two got to drop. Jeremy, I'm good to keep going if we want to finish. Like we want to wrap up the rules section.
I can talk about this stuff all day.
So like, so I think what we could do is feats, right? So in general, I think feats are the least offensive of all the things that they've presented to me here.
Yes.
The things that I liked about the feats are that there are prerequisites now. I really like that because it means that they can start putting in more feats and more powerful feats and have prerequisites like they did in previous editions of D&D. I really like that. I think the feats are also much better than they were in 5e. Healer is an awesome first level feat. It actually makes the healer's kit a little bit more useful, like in a really good way. But then there are some that I think are kind of feel homebrew, like the Tavern Brawler. The Tavern Brawler is a really weird one if you look at it.
I actually like it because it's so weird. Like it's,
I don't. So here's the thing. The thing I don't like about it. I don't think for me at least. Correct me if I'm wrong, everyone else. But none of these really made me uncomfortable, like backgrounds and race.
Oh no, not at all.
I think they're just so inconsistently designed. I think that.
I mean,
for instance,
I think this is where they had all the folks on the design team working together and kind of this is maybe a slightly revised first pass of what they came up with, which is why.
I mean, if you look at Tavern Brawler,
Yeah.
Tavern Brawler has the shove ability, and it's like the text is literally the same as the shove feature, right, for an unarmed strike, except there's no size limitation. So based on these rules of Tavern Brawler, I can fucking shove whatever I want. Oh, that's that's good. That was a very poorly executed sentence on my part. I could shove a dragon because there are no size limitations on that text, right? And then, of course, you could wield furniture as weapons. Anybody could pick up a chair and hit somebody with it. For me, it would have been you get to add your proficiency bonus to using furniture as weapons.
That's the more balanced way to do it, but I like how like homebrewy this is. Like you can wield furniture as a weapon using the rules of the Great Club for small or medium furniture.
But literally anybody can. That's the thing. I can pick up a table and just chuck it, right? I do like, they have this enhanced unarmed strike, and that, they get these damage rerolls. I would have just worked that into enhanced unarmed strike, to be quite honest, because if you read them in isolation of one another, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I
love the musicians. I think that's very
good. The musician's very good. I mean, I think what I do like is the fact that it does sort of hint that they are getting a bit experimental with ripping these feats apart and kind of adding more to them, and perhaps using parts of D&D that are not very useful at the moment, like like the various kits and tools and stuff like that. Like, let's see some more mechanical proficiencies for that. And I think, once again, going back to what we talked about before, I like how not all of these just like you have advantage on your next attack, which is something
like your this stat increases by this. I like that these feel like the feats of 3rd edition and 3.5.
Yeah.
And that's prerequisites too. I really like that because you have something to work towards. You can build a character. Like, are they going to bring back power attack? No, they won't.
Another thing that's like, it's not offensive. It's offensive to my sensibilities, but not to the world at large. But is crafter, because like D&D 5th edition is so laissez-faire with how you make anything and how you buy anything.
Materials. Yeah,
like every time one of my players goes, "Hi, I want to buy a 5 by 5 foot box capable of holding blank," and I'm just like, ugh.
Guys, let me bath this.
I don't know.
Let me
7
hold- let me-
silver.
Let me hold
No,
you in a fiery
7 silver. Hold on, I get 20% off.
20%
Oh
discount.
shit!
I
No,
have my crafting license.
No, it's,
I have
it's
my
like you go to
Groupon.
Costco. You can
It's
you have
Costco.
Costco.
hold on. I have to cut out this coupon from the newspaper right at the table.
The crafter is the dad with the t-shirt tucked into the shorts at the Home Depot. That's the crafter
Yeah.
right there.
Yeah, the
Here,
crafter, you just
discount.
flash your AARP card.
I do think the entire crafting system in 5e could probably use a rehaul, which is a great thing to do for One D&D because the required crafting time is reduced by 20% in the faster crafting part of the crafter. But I don't even know what the crafting time is for items off the top of my head. Isn't it like ridiculously long? I never use it because I don't use it.
I don't use it.
Yeah,
So
well,
the thing-
yeah, it's like some. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I mean, like, I'm currently writing an artificer subclass, and I'm just like, I don't know how long it's going to take for me to make an infusion. Like, kind of, sort of, maybe. And it's like my infusions are all about like fiber art, so I'm like, I don't know how long it's going to take for my person to make a scarf.
So if you're a crafter and if you have crafter and you're an artificer, you make scarves 20% faster.
You make it. You're just like knitting, just
I
like
think we
knitting
need
like a mad woman.
Slightly more defined subsystems for things like crafting before we can start being like, you get 20% off, or this makes you 20% faster.
Yeah, I would have also appreciated if they gave us second level feats so we could see what their thought process is on the prerequisites, because these are all first level
how do they
feats.
scale up?
How do they scale up? I want to see that.
25% discount.
Yeah, I mean, like,
Well, no, because the prerequisites in
it just levels it up. Like,
so, I mean, there were prerequisites on other things. When they had prerequisites across multiple things in D&D, you had to be an elf, you had to have this feat, you had to have this much dex, and so I want to see what they're thinking about here.
It'll probably be something like Tavern Brawler, where now you can like break up buildings.
Tavern Brawling.
Yeah. Prerequisite is Tavern Brawler, and now you get to you can re-roll your
barrels.
damage. You can
Barrels
re-roll your
ranged
damage.
weapons now.
Yeah, you can re-roll your
my
damage
gosh, you
die
just
for
turned
rolls
into
of 1
Donkey
to
Kong.
5 or something like
your bludgeoning damage is now 1d6 plus your strength, and then it just has a little picture of Crawford just shrugging, like, I don't know, man.
Yeah.
I don't work here.
We get a feat called Luckier.
I'm also a little
where it's
sad
like-
that there isn't. I'm also sad there isn't like a grapple section of Tavern Brawler because
Yeah.
to just command grab everything.
No, you would have different holds. Like you get the
He just
Imanari roll.
Bowser side B.
I mean, now you're talking about a whole class, the Tavern
we have
Brawler.
a template. We have a
Should be.
template for this, and it is Gaston. And I just feel like
Yeah.
it's easy enough.
Yeah, but I think like feats are. You could tell where they were trying to be the most creative here. And it's because they weren't thinking about trying to make this compatible with 5e. It's just like, hey, let's just try to make these things. And yeah, they miss at some points because they're like, well, we don't know anything about crafting. But there's some really good things here, like the healer, which makes you actually think about how many uses your healer's kit have left. I would buy a healer's kit so I could use that healer thing. There are feats that I would get multiple times. Magic Initiate is really cool because you could have, all these different kinds of spells, which is really a neat thing. And there could be narrative reasons for it, right? Every time I'm a bard and I've gone and learned and spent time with different, sort of spellcasters, I can get Magic Initiate every single time I have this sort of narrative milestone. It could be really neat. And then it would have a mechanical impact on my character.
Yeah, that's why I love the musician. I think it's such a cute little.
It's great.
Little mini bard, just like a little taste of bard. And yeah, it's definitely a little chocolate box, chocolate selection.
I like how they're doing more stuff with inspiration. I will say that, like how the musician can play an inspiring song.
I have thoughts on the inspiration, but that's it. I'm just keeping track of time. Drew and Michelle, do you folks have to bounce?
Yes, I do have to leave, but thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, no, I really loved looking at this a little bit more in depth with y'all. Thank you for allowing me to yell at you. I'm sorry.
Just yell at each other.
I'm sorry for sticking the Dickens stands on y'all, and
I mean,
but I'm sure
they're
that
coming after you too.
Coming after me. My Twitter's just gonna blow up with all these people.
Absolutely. We'll have you on. The four of us could gather again for a part 2 where we'll go through each of these sections and be like, okay, this is what I would change here, and we could go get really granular with it.
Yeah,
We'll figure
Love
out
it.
when. I think
All
episode
right.
61 perhaps of Asians Represent. We'll
Sure.
try it out.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. I'm gonna go. You can. I'm just gonna go join the Valor game. That's
Yeah,
being
just go play.
streamed.
Shout out to
I'm
Valor's
gonna go play
games. Go play
Valor.
Valor.
Shout
Take care,
out.
Michelle.
Shout out.
Yeah.
Okay,
All right,
bye,
friends.
Michelle.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
All right, so we can keep going because this is the cool thing about Riverside that we're using right now. So Michelle drops. We've got all this. So that said, moving on, we've talked about how the feats are they're hit and miss. Some are really good, some are kind of meh, some feel incomplete. I want to talk about the rules. I want to talk about they've made a big shift here and they've said, okay, this is the D20 test. They didn't mention DC. They've removed the use of DC, and they're like, hey, this is the target number, which I think is cool because a lot of people are like, what does DC stand for? I like this. Now, the one thing I really have an issue with here is what it does to the GM. And I know there are folks who are going to be like, oh, well, Daniel doesn't even track HP. Why does this matter? This I think really matters for me because when they talk about rolling a 1, they say if you roll a 1 on the D20, the D20 test automatically fails regardless of any modifiers on the roll. Yeah. And I think this really sucks for higher level gameplay. For skill like tests. I'm not talking about combat. It makes sense in combat, but at a higher level, like say you're a level 20 character, you have mastered every aspect of your being. You always have a 5% chance of failing at something, no matter how high your bonus is, which is what I really hate.
I don't like this either, but I think it's telling that they included it because they said the only reason they did this automatic success on the 20, automatic failure on 1 is because so many people were doing that already. But so many people, particularly with this edition of D&D, are not doing high level play because 5th edition kind of falls apart after level 15, or maybe
level apart after level 10.
Level 10, yeah. So I don't think this is going to make it through the playtest because this is getting a lot of flack, and I personally don't like it for the same reasons you pointed out.
I also really hate the section on rolling a 20. I think I even wrote in my notes, and I'll share the PDF with all my annotations for our patrons. But I wrote, I fucking hate this. I fucking hate this, period. Because it means that any roll has a 5% chance of succeeding. Now, yeah, everyone has a chance, but I think you're going to run into some issues here because if you're a GM and you want to say present, okay, let's talk about our home game, Drew.
Hell right? Yeah.
Your character. Drew's character in the story is one of the sort of subplots is you're seeking this martial arts master in my setting. And let's say you meet Master Chi-Sin and she's like, show me what you've got. And I want to have
knock her out.
Yeah, I want to have that fight, but I don't want you, and I want you to roll, and I want it to be a moment, and you fucking roll a 20 and you just kill this martial arts master. This encourages me to basically say, okay, if I want to present the party or a character with a seemingly impossible task that's meant to fail to drive the story forward, this rule prevents me from asking them to roll. Because if I don't tell you, Drew, the character to roll, you know that you're supposed to fail. Or if I tell you to roll, I know that there's a 5% chance that you can succeed and kind of fuck up what I've planned. So having a high sort of hidden DC, or in this case, sort of target number, is no longer a reliable tool for the GM to ensure the players can fail. Now, if the GM says, okay, you don't have to roll for this, just tell me what you do, and I'll tell you what happens, that alone gives players meta knowledge that they are either meant to fail or they could always succeed. So I really dislike this.
It's one thing when, it's, a critical hit in a fight, and you know that, let's say as a GM, you threw a character at the party that you know for a fact they cannot fight and defeat. Like, that's not what that character is meant for. That character is meant to be an ultra threat that they eventually level up to be able to fight successfully later on. Okay,
that really happened in our game, though.
Yeah,
but Mark sacrificed his character to make sure that thing couldn't come back. That was
what a moment.
What a moment.
Shout out to Mark.
I think I would personally like to see something that that emulates the degrees of success that like Pathfinder Second Edition has really built its whole system around.
I like
I don't,
that.
I don't know if they'll do that because once again, that is kind of Pathfinder's thing at the moment. But it's like if you roll 10 or above over whatever the target number is, that's critical success. 10 below, that's critical failure. And there are different degrees for what your spells do, for what your success does. Like you might succeed on a roll, but you might succeed with a consequence, which is kind of tying in with what like with what Powered by the Apocalypse games do really well.
Yeah.
I that is kind of hidden in current 5th edition in the DMG as an optional thing, I think. But once again, I don't know if they can really go with that because going with degrees of success changes the rules of the game on a fundamental level, which will make things less backwards compatible. So.
It completely. And another thing here is, and this is another thing that I wrote that I actually find really concerning, is that the fact that you can succeed if you have a 5% chance at succeeding any dice roll really bothers me in the case of organized play, sort of adventurers league or conventions, because it literally enables the player who says, I seduce whatever.
Yeah.
It fully enables, because the GM can no longer say, okay, roll, knowing that you're never going to succeed. That reinforces my point, right?
Yeah.
The GM will basically say, okay, well, in previous, D&D, it was like, yeah, roll, and they're never going to succeed. So you'll always know, like, okay, well, they reject you, blah, 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 you're an asshole, right? But now if the GM says, oh, you can't roll, well, then that gives some meta knowledge to the player. Or if the GM says, yeah, roll for it, and you roll a 20, like, that's going to make so many people uncomfortable at the table.
I also think these rules really solidify the fact that D&D is, like we talked about, Daniel, staying away from those high modifiers and those high numbers that get into like the 30s and above. Like if it's just a 20 is a success, we're solely dealing with D20 tests of around like the 15 to 20 range pretty much. And you're not going to see those high numbers, that high level play. Yeah. Like I don't think that's been taken into account. And if D&D wants to become a game that completely disregards like the upper tiers of play, just maxes out at level 10, that's an interesting decision in itself. But we won't get that if they're not calling.
I mean, we saw what happened with the epic. We saw what happened with the epic level handbook. Did people use that?
Yeah.
Right. I see this in the chat. A lot of folks are saying, roll less, or it's a GM situation where they say, oh, it doesn't work. But remember, at the start of this stream or recording, we basically said we're reacting to what this document presents. And so this, this conversation right here is about the information that it's giving the player here. And it's saying, if you get a 20, you automatically succeed. If you get a 1, you automatically fail no matter what. And the next thing that kind of bothered me was the fact, and I don't know why, critical hits are only for PCs. And PCs, like the GM can no longer crit. Which,
I think, they seem to
I don't know why.
They seem to be pushing with the logic that at lower levels, because 5th edition suffers at like levels 1 and probably 2 as well, because like the monsters can crit and totally destroy a PC. I think they're going with the idea of trying to prevent that by only having the players crit and the monsters. They have their recharge. The monsters have recharge abilities, like a breath weapon can recharge on a 5 and a 6.
So they're really leaning into the power fantasy part.
They're really leaning into the power fantasy part. And I think they're actually leaning into what looks good on a stream, to be very honest with you, because that is what D&D is in many ways now. And like when a player gets that big moment on a stream, I rolled a natural 20, critical hit,
Yeah, but here's the thing though, if the GM rolls a critical hit, that's just more drama for the stream.
Can potentially kill a player though, and killing a player on stream.
Well, here's the thing, we don't have rules on character death, but hey, like here's the thing, like if you're at a lower level, we can either communicate this is a power fantasy and that you're gonna, for the most part, be untouchable and free from like mortal danger, or we could say, hey, you're in danger at lower levels and you get more powerful. And sure, like we've had critical hits like for multiple editions of D&D, and yeah, they could certainly swing the flow of combat, but I see no reason why the GM can't crit. Especially when the players now have a rule where they can succeed, like they have a guaranteed success on something.
I think it's also hard to fully assess this without seeing monster stat blocks and how they might change.
Absolutely.
Because if they're giving like new recharge abilities to monsters where like, hey, they have different variations of multi-attack, or they have maybe crunchier stat blocks instead of just, I bite and I attack twice with my dagger, which is a lot of 5e monsters.
Yeah.
It's hard to assess how this might play out in an actual game or a stream. Or
there's another thing right here, and it says, and it's the same thing because they give you the average value for damage for a monster. And so this could be their justification, but they basically say if your weapon or unarmed strike has no damage dice, it deals no extra damage on a crit. That means that you can't crit on an unarmed strike unless you're you have a tavern brawler, or you're like a monk. Which makes no sense to me, because literally last weekend, Drew and I watched Leon Edwards knock out Kamaru Usman in the UFC with a head kick with 50 seconds left in the fight.
Yeah.
And anything can happen. And the fact that a punch can't be a crit baffles me.
I understand. Okay, so with Monsters of the Multiverse, take this with a grain of salt, but if I remember correctly, part of the philosophy was they were trying to up both damage values from various creatures, as well as upping some of their tankiness, some of their health pools. Because they were running to the issue of like, the paladin smites and one shots the CR7
That's
creature.
why you don't track HP. Validation right there.
Yeah. But like, maybe it's supposed to go hand in hand with that change in design philosophy.
I think it is.
Yeah.
But
I guess we'll see when like Jeremy, you said, we haven't seen monsters yet.
The issue is like, sorry, go ahead, Drew.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I also think that some of the rolling a 1 and rolling a 20 also doesn't take into account things like, okay, let's say I have some really top secret information as a GM that I'm withholding, and I'm making it a DC 28, and you roll a natural 20 with a +7, you get a 27. I mean, I'm going to give you something, like, so at least in my anecdote, as myself as a GM and my experience with other GMs, where I'm the player, some of the sliding scale of success and failure, or those different demarcations, like with what Pathfinder does.
Yep.
Degrees of
still
success
kind of already exists in my brain.
Yeah. Degrees of success. Just, I think a lot of people probably do that, Drew. Just stick it in the rules. But I think it's a problem because it seems like they're prioritizing lower numbers in this edition. And I mean, D&D 5e
certainly are.
D&D 5e already, you don't really see people rolling like 30s that often.
They took out the ability for people to do something like that, right?
Yeah, it would require a fundamental rework of a lot of the game mechanics, which is basically like a new edition, and they're not calling it a new edition because, they want
absolutely
continuity.
I mean, let's think about the spell True Strike, right? And I keep going back to True Strike.
It sounds like you're saying Drew Strike, and
Drew
I'm like,
Strike,
I have not struck anything recently.
Drew's your
Drew
Pokemon.
Strike.
Strike for me, Drew.
Strike, Drew. So here's the thing, like, True Strike in previous editions of D&D and Pathfinder was like, you get +20 to your next attack. Right?
Yeah, that's hot.
And it's dope. But now it's like 5e, it's like, you get advantage.
You get advantage.
You
No,
get advantage.
I want my +20, sir.
I want my fucking +20, because you're like, I'm going to hit that one shot, or I have this spell. We got one shot. I'm going to give you +20. Like, that's a cool moment. You don't get that with advantage.
I mean, I realize that there is an elegance to the advantage system, and a lot of people liked it when it first came out. But there's nothing like getting a +20 and or getting some kind of super ridiculous modifier that, like, I rolled a 41, and then just everyone goes nuts. But then again,
awesome.
But then again, maybe I'm just fond of that era of D&D. I don't know.
I think the three of us all like that. Now, I
don't like excessive math, but I do like big numbers. I like the end result of excessive math.
You just want the outcome, not the journey.
I grew up playing JRPGs where I had to max out my damage at 9999 or whatever. So yeah, I like those big numbers.
Oh yeah. So speaking of that sort of advantage, disadvantage, another thing that they brought in here was inspiration. And now, Jeremy, you said that you liked inspiration.
I like how well. I'd like to hear your take on it, because as it stands, I find inspiration is often forgotten in a lot of games I've played.
Agreed. So that's what I dislike.
I've forgotten it myself at times, and I wanted to see it integrated perhaps a little bit more into the
game. I haven't given the players in my home game inspiration in like 30 sessions.
Yeah.
In my game, as well as some of the games I play in St. Louis, where I live. Don't come visit me, anyone, except for you two. You two can visit me. and we'll say half the chat. Half the chat can visit me.
Half the chat.
It's up to you to figure out who that is.
Everyone has to fight Squid Games.
I'm a pretty shitty prize, but but in my games, it's like, you bring me snack, I bring you inspiration. There's never any in-game reason that I give anyone inspiration. Yeah. It's purely bribery for real life things.
Now I know from when I eventually meet you in person.
I mean, I don't know if they want to like for example, in our Pathfinder game, I hand out hero points all the time, and like you got hero points are basically like Pathfinder Second Edition's version of inspiration. And you start the session with a hero point, and you can use it for any reroll. And sometimes when you die, you can use a hero point to stabilize yourself. So do you think it would be better if like they had a rule where it's like you start the game with inspiration and you can?
So I have a thought here. So there are optional rules for hero points in 5e.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
that's the thing, but people forget about them. So here's what I do with hero points, and I'll actually, you know what? I'll make this available for the Asians Represent patrons, because folks who follow me on Patreon already have had access to this for months. So I have like a set of rules that I use for hero points, but I just make them chi. So what I hate about inspiration in 5e and this is that you can only have one at a time. I fucking hate that. It's like, oh, I could just have one inspiration, and you hold on to it. It's the same effect that Breath of the Wild had on players. When you knew that your weapons were going to break, you held off from using them because you were afraid of losing them. Same thing with inspiration. It's like, you don't know when you're going to get the next one. Maybe your GM is like Daniel and you just don't hand them out. But you hold on to that, right? Having one at a time, I really dislike. You get inspiration in this case for getting a 20 or for roleplay, which I think is cool that they've codified that. In this, within the context of this rule. Yeah, you get an instant success, makes sense to me. I dislike that you lose inspiration when you start a long rest. It's like, time to nap, everyone.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
It's literally right after it says losing inspiration. If you still have inspiration when you start a long rest, you lose that inspiration, which I think is moronic. In my mind, I would have said, you know what, inspiration lasts the entire session, right? Or if you wanted to get like really granular, if you're going to let people have more than one for the scene. For me, what I would like is if you could hand out more of it, and it could be used for more things. So for me, hero points or chi can be used for a couple of things. You could accumulate them, and so you could spend them to reroll spend one to reroll damage on a single attack. You can add damage to attack roll, and they're in different things. So you could spend, in mine, you could spend 4 points to cheat death. So you prevent instant death from massive damage. You could also spend 3 points to test your limits and receive an extra action on your turn. I like this sort of stuff because I'm accumulating it, and I'm encouraged to spend it because there are lots of things that I can use it for, right? For instance, you could do something where you could spend it to gain hit points back, right? You can. My thing is, you still have fight left, and you could heal similar to a short rest by using chi for to roll a hit die. It consumes a hit die, obviously, but you can do that. Or you could do something like dig deep. If I spend 1 hero point or 1 chi point, I could regain the single use of a class feature that requires a short rest if it's 2 points, or 3 points for a feature that requires a long rest to regenerate. I want to have more options, because if it's just like you get advantage and disadvantage and it goes away when you take a long rest, I'm not going to care about it. Especially if I know I have a 5% chance of always succeeding on something.
Yeah.
So the way inspiration is presented here, there's nothing objectively wrong about it, but I think it's boring, and it really doesn't mesh well with how they are trying to frame success in this system. So for me, if you're going to do inspiration, honestly, ditch inspiration, call it hero points. You can get them if you get a 20, and you can get them if you do something cool. Maybe there's a limit. I wouldn't. For my chi system, there is. But for this, maybe there's no limit, but you lose them at the end of a session. So people are encouraged to try to go for broke, get these things, and it actually adds to that power fantasy. How cool would it be where it's just like this dragon just breath weapons you? Like this actually, yeah. In our Pathfinder game, when I'm like, I'm gonna save you, Drew.
That was a good moment. Yeah.
So
it was, you can tell it, Daniel. Yeah.
Okay. So There is this moment when Drew's holding off these zombies and we're gonna try to blow them up, and Drew's like, I'm gonna sacrifice myself. And I'm this like creepy, unhinged puppet. So I'm like, I'm gonna climb on front of Drew's chest and hold him like a backpack on the front and absorb the blast.
Yeah, it was Drew's character was pushing a bunch of zombies. They were in a house, and the zombies were invading the house, and they were climbing down the chimney. Drew's character was going to force them up the chimney, and like they were gonna, one of the zombies was trying to explode. So Drew was going to absorb the force of the explosion and just take all the damage, as Drew does in every single game.
But Drew's character also didn't have a lot of health at that point.
Yes. And so Daniel wanted to protect his friend and just climbed on him because he's a little puppet and looked up at Drew and was like, hey, buddy, I got you. And then it was...
Explosion. I just got fucked up.
Drew's next action was to save his little friend by picking him up and throwing him across the room. And Daniel went sailing, still with his eyes closed. He still thought he was holding his buddy. He's like, I got you, man. Don't worry.
And then Drew's down.
Everyone got hero points after that, though. So it was great.
But here's the thing, right? If I had the ability to just like cheat instant death and take and like spend my hero points to do that, I could have absorbed the blast, and that narrative moment would have been really interesting, and it would have been informed by things mechanically and previous actions, right? And it would reinforce roleplay and stuff like that. So that's why I think the inspiration here is a really missed opportunity to do something a little different.
Yeah, I think that, I think everyone pretty quickly realized that with with this D&D 5th edition, I feel like people pretty quickly realized that the very open-ended nature of so many of its rules, or just the complete lack of, with the disclaimer of, you figure it out with your table.
Work with your DM.
Yeah, work with your DM.
Yeah. Yes, does it have some advantages? Sure. Because then you get less of the rules lawyering of like the GM trying to make that call on the fly or create something cool and new, and then the player goes, well, what about page 53-A? Like you get less of that, but at the same time, you have, hundreds of thousands of GMs that have no idea what to rule or what to say to that. And I think at this point, that issue has been fully realized, and a lot of this is perhaps a response. This is speculation, but a lot of this is perhaps response to all those issues. So they're trying to nail some of this down. But I think they're hitting the wrong spots sometimes.
Especially with these really granular rules about a long rest, where it has to be at least 6 hours of sleep, and you can't do more than 2 hours of light activity. But
also, we're going to add in a character.
But we're going to... if you walk for an hour during your long rest, you lose your long rest.
Yeah. So
I think this kind of speaks to the bigger process going on here, which is like D&D 5th edition, which is going to become One D&D. But as it stands now, 5th edition is not particularly crunchy compared to other editions of the game and other systems out there. But it wants to be kind of crunchy. It's like medium crunch. However, it also wants to be rules light, but it's not as rules light or as good as storytelling as like a Powered by the Apocalypse game or, like Monster Heart, like something like that. And so it inhabits this in-between space where it's trying to do a lot of things and be everything for everyone. And, that leads to the question, well, what does D&D, what does One
do well? What does it do well?
Want to be? Because if you look at the current books, at the bottom of every book on the cover, it says, the world's greatest role-playing game. And they're trying to trademark that. I think in the Spelljammer books, I noticed there's like a TM sign there. They're trademarking that. But what is the world's greatest role-playing game? Because you could easily argue that if you want a tactical dungeon-delving monster experience, you could go elsewhere and get a better version of that. You could also argue if you want like a storytelling experience for your magical school adventure, you could go to plenty of other systems for that. What exactly is the world's greatest role-playing game? First of all, that term doesn't really exist. There is no world's greatest. There is perhaps, the world's
It's the world's greatest for you and your friends.
There is perhaps like the world's most accessible, but I don't think D&D is that either. I think it's just D&D is perhaps the world's most famous or the most widely known role-playing game.
I think it's the most accessible because of its notoriety.
Because of its notoriety.
And because D&D Beyond is definitely one of the best character management tools.
So where does D&D go from here? Like, how do they find a new definition for world's most role-playing game, because a lot of these rules in here, they do feel like they're playing catch up to the rest of the industry. Because 5th edition came out in 2014. That was a very different time. And like we've talked about with the race stuff, there's a lot of the Ancestry and Culture DM's Guild supplement. There's a lot of Pathfinder in there. There's a lot of D&D kind of trying to catch up with the discussions and the discourse on Twitter.
This is what happens when you're unchallenged for so long, right? Let's use this as a great example, because they don't sponsor us anymore. Roll20. Roll20 was like the big thing. But if you look at Roll20's UI, it's really inaccessible. It's super clunky, and I would rather use anything else, right? Like I used what's the one that starts with an F?
Foundry.
I learned how to use Foundry for the first time, and that system is great. Owlbear Rodeo is super minimalistic and accessible. D&D Beyond is going to have its own VTT now, and honestly, I will say this. I think D&D Beyond's virtual experience is going to tell us a lot about what they want.
Yeah, that's
interesting.
That's interesting. Like, if they want D&D to be the quote unquote world's greatest role playing game, then they have to be. I guess we can take it to mean they want D&D to be a leader in this space, which it already is, perhaps financially, but certainly not in terms of mechanics. I think, or providing the most accessible or the most. The best experience for a new variety of its players. And I think, seeing how the VTT works,
I have concerns about it.
Yeah, I have concerns about it too. I mean, I don't think that's going to run on a lot of people's computers.
Yeah, that's exactly. They're developing it in Unreal 5. Yeah. It's going to be, again, it's going to be great for streaming. It looks exactly like, well, again, this is all concept. We haven't actually seen gameplay. But it looks like they're trying to do Tailspire, Drew. Like, you and I spent a lot of time building in Tailspire. That shit's hard to build. It's fun.
That's tough.
It's tough, but it's hard to build, and you need a really good computer. And
there's
will
no
need
such thing in it as whipping together a map real fast.
No, but there will be such a thing as buying maps from the marketplace.
Yeah, they will probably include
just like Foundry.
Maps you can buy. They'll probably include digital only versions of adventures where you can get the maps directly, in their fancy new VTT setup. But that's interesting. Is that the direction that D&D wants to go, to be, the world's greatest role playing game? I don't know. Like, I think it's a worthy goal to try to do, to give us that virtual experience. However, I don't necessarily think that that's going to be something everyone's going to use.
What I want out of...
But they will want people to use it.
You know what I want out of the D&D Beyond Virtual Tabletop? I want an E3 shitty trailer.
Of Dritz Jordan with shaking his head in the camera.
I want a completely garbage trailer that is like voice actors from the bargain bin who are just voice acting a script that sounds like what gamers, or in this case RPG players, are supposed to sound like.
It'll be like that old viral video where it's like, I cast magic missile, or I forget.
Fear of Girls.
Yeah, Fear of Girls.
Yeah, so I want a voice actor to go, oh man, I just critically struck that dragon.
Oh my god, it's going to be like when
it's going to be
when the Division came out. When the Division came out, and they had voice actors doing like.
It's so scripted. Yeah. Well, they did that with the day before. Okay, here's my pitch for D&D Beyond VTT E3 2024 or whatever. You have the stage set.
Yeah.
Who overpromises everything? Sean Murray comes out.
I thought you were going to say Todd Howard.
No, Sean Murray of No Man's Sky fame comes out. Begins to overpromise things. And then we get the Halo 3 commercial when it was all one diorama.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It's going to be one single diorama of a D&D battle. And Sean Murray's talking about, this is an unparalleled virtual experience. Bring the tabletop to your screens. And then we'll cut in with virtual gameplay that looks exactly like that new Brandon Sanderson involved game that was just shown at Gamescom. And we're going to see gameplay. We're going to see people like, oh my God, and it's going to run flawlessly. But then when it goes to most people's computers, it's going to be glitchy. It's going to be slow. It's going to lag. Honestly, if you don't have hardware acceleration on, Foundry doesn't work well.
Yeah, that's actually part of the reason why I still use Roll20 is because I run games for a lot of people with potato PCs. And like
Owlbear is
Roll20
anybody
can
can
work well for them. So, yeah. I would use Alabama more if it had more than just 5e stuff.
Albert doesn't have anything.
It's more geared towards 5e a little bit, like the tokens and stuff are a little bit more 5e.
I guess you could put hexes on it and stuff like that. I get what you're saying.
I definitely could. Yeah. I mean, Roll20 also is very 5e oriented. Like that's all they prioritize. So I guess
they have their own system. They have Burn Bright.
They have Burn Bright, but I haven't seen Burn Bright promo for like the last couple of years. I don't know. Maybe I haven't been looking.
I mean, Burn Bright was. I mean, and this is no shade to anybody. It's a cool thing. I've played it. Burn Bright is essentially, the tabletop RPG version of a console exclusive. That's essentially what it was. And unfortunately, there were things about the console that people didn't want to use that console, no matter how good that game was.
Well, and when D&D comes out with their VTT, that'll be the console exclusive thing for D&D in many ways.
Exactly. Well, here's the thing: you don't need a macro or some sort of mod to take your D&D Beyond character into Foundry or whatever, right? It's there. I know I'm going to use it. Right? Because, hey, we've got this VTT. Our characters are already here. We've already been playing. I'm buying books. I'm buying all the digital content. It makes sense to play here.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm excited to see how it'll turn out.
And who knows if it'll be free? Maybe it's another paid thing.
I don't think it's going to be free. It's going to be a paid thing, most definitely. But I think it's a... Like, I am glad that D&D is doing that. Like, I think if they're going to call themselves the world's greatest role-playing game, they need to do stuff like offer physical and digital bundles. They need to do stuff like perhaps experiment around with the VTT, environment.
Hero Forge integration.
Hero Forge integration, but they're probably going to include their own thing. They're going to give you minis that you can customize and buy in packs, and that's I doubt
they're already doing that with their physical minis. Like D&D finally started making minis on sprues.
Oh, so, yeah, that is a new thing.
That is a new thing.
The frameworks line or whatever it's called.
Yeah. So, like, I think the VTT, I think people are really sleeping on the fact that the VTT is going to tell us a lot about what they want D&D to be. Because the VTT is going to be shiny. It's going to be a visual experience for people who are streaming, right? It's going to be a novel thing for folks.
Because but is it going to be able to cross that divide between, like, the crunchy side of D&D and the rules light story?
Well, that's exactly it. It depends on how that system works.
Because I don't see a lot of like narrative DMs necessarily getting involved with the whole map making process, or people running.
Not at all.
Games.
I don't. But I think because it'll be integrated into your character, your ranges will already be there. The blast radius is. I think you'll have all of that. And honestly, the way from my like 10-ish hours playing Tailspire, I would fucking play that in an instant if I had full maps and everything. It also really depends on how easy the system is to use.
Yeah. So I mean, it makes me wonder: are they going to be leaning more to the crunch? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think so. If the experience is not a top-down traditional VTT, and it is indeed a 3D thing that you can move around, like Tabletop Simulator or Tailspire, I think it would lend itself to the crunch. Mm-hmm. Though I will say this. If you look at the history of wargaming, the vast majority of wargaming's history was spent with rules light using minis, right? If you look at, I mean, we could do a whole episode on this, but like a lot of narrative war games around the time that Arneson and Gygax were kind of thinking about doing D&D, the Bronstein, were really narrative driven, but involved terrain and involved minis with roleplay elements. So I think it's possible because there is, again, a rich tradition of doing that. Think about, the way some of Warhammer is working right now. They have narrative elements to it. Think about games like Rangers of Shadowdeep, which have deep narrative, but also, combat. I think that the VTT will certainly cater to those who want crunch. But based on what we've seen here, I think the One D&D playtest that we're looking at right now with, how they want to measure range and bonuses and how crits work and how feats work too, I think will certainly be suited to a really quick and simple VTT experience. And by quick and simple, I mean, you plop your characters in, the GM has to probably put in a lot of work to building a map. But once you're there, you're using that D&D character sheet to roll. hey, if I pick a target, how cool would it be if I'm going to cast Fireball and it actually does the Fireball for me?
It'll be
So I
interesting to
think,
see if they can pull that off.
and the thing is, like, there is going to be crunch, but I think a lot of people are forgetting that the fact that this VTT will be integrated into D&D Beyond, which does the crunch for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's mostly the conversation of crunch is not in how you're actually making your character, and more of, are you going into combat a lot? Are you measuring range? Are you tracking ammunition, or how many uses you've taken out of your healer's kit? So I think we also need to consider how much of the crunch will be taken care of by this digital system.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And how difficult it'll be to use homebrew, considering how tough it is to use homebrew on D&D Beyond right now.
That's another thing. That's another thing. I literally will like.
It would be interesting if this VTT has two modes, not just an overhead battle map mode, but some sort of narrative, like visual novel type story mode experience as well. I don't know if that's possible.
Have you seen the VTT more multiverse? One more multiverse.
Yeah, one more multiverse. They're talking about that in the Twitch chat right now. I've seen it. Oh, yeah. I don't know how well it works, but I
have access to it. I've had a really hard time trying to make something there. It's just, it doesn't feel intuitive to me, but I like the execution of it. I like the idea of it. I like that you could build these sort of easy to build environments that people can interact with. But again, I think that also is really, for the most part, you're limiting your players to specific environments when you do that. Because nothing will ever be as fast as drawing on a dry erase battle map.
Yeah. And also, there's, to get into the discussion of accessibility, like D&D, if they take this heavy VTT approach, it slowly becomes more like a video game. And a lot of people don't want a video game when they play a role-playing game. They want something else. They want, like, talking with people in a more social experience. So that's another discussion in general.
Yeah, I think that's still going to be here for these things, for this, because this is by far not the crunchiest we've ever seen D&D. And by the standards of its contemporaries, One D&D is not that crunchy. It's far less crunchy. It's way less crunchy than Pathfinder 2.
Yeah, it's not that crunchy. Yeah, I mean, I would like it to be more crunchy, honestly. Like I'm more.
Me
in favor
too.
of crunch.
Honestly,
but I just feel like a large segment of new D&D players don't want that, and I'm very interested to see how WotC handles the differing perceptions of what D&D needs to be, what people
honestly,
like
they haven't actually made this One D&D thing crunchier. They've just moved the crunch and numbers around.
Yeah, because I think
that's all they've done.
There's a limit to how much they can do with the backwards compatibility thing, and so that's what I think is maybe going to hold this next iteration of D&D back.
I still think this backwards compatibility, whether it's for the
smoke
sake
and
of
mirrors.
It is smoke and mirrors. It is definitely.
I don't think backwards compatibility is a good idea. Whether we're talking about it from the perspective of trying to address various problematic content within D&D, like it's mechanized or put in stone, or we're talking simply about like player proclivities with crunch and play styles and things like that. I just think getting tied down to 5th edition and how that framework is a bad idea for the growth of the game, even if that growth is not something that I end up enjoying. Like,
it's something that you see, and it's literally something that you see in video games.
Gotta let go.
It's something you see in video games, right? Because when you see a game that's like, hey, we're gonna make this backwards compatible, or it's gonna come out for the PS4 and the PS5, you're gonna sacrifice quality in trying to make it backwards compatible, right? There's differences here, and this is in technological performance, not the systems themselves. But the point I'm trying to make is, if they're like, oh, everything's backwards compatible, what's preventing people from just not getting One D&D products and just continuing to play 5e?
Well, I think they're going to have to eventually. Eventually, they will be phased out. It's only backwards compatible, I think, up to a certain point, and then I think they're slowly going to put those old players' handbooks and everything else out of print. And yeah, if you have
for
them,
sure,
you can still keep on playing them. Just how like people keep on playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, like you can definitely keep on doing that. But the new materials, the new adventures, they're going to be geared more towards this new rule set, and they're probably going to be references in there that require you to buy like the new monster manual or the new.
Of course. So then it's no longer truly backwards compatible. compatible.
It's the only things that
eventually it will iterate beyond what it can back compatible with. That's not a word. That's not a way to phrase that.
Same with balance too. Think about how Feats will work.
Yeah.
Think about how Feats will work.
Feats are going to change the game. And I think the only things that will be semi-backwards compatible are maybe a couple adventures here and there. Like, yeah, sure, probably in 2028, we'll still be able to run the version of Curse of Strahd that came out in like 2016 or 2017.
Stat blocks will change, though.
But stat blocks will change. And I guarantee by that time, there will probably be a Curse of Strahd 10th edition geared towards One D&D that is going to have a new cover, and new things, and probably new VTT maps. And everybody's going to switch to that. It's only backwards compatible, maybe for perhaps the first year or two, and then it's going to, everybody's going to replace their books like how they did when 3.5 came out.
I still have both of mine.
But if and even if they don't, like, the difference between trying to have One D&D as a the whole conversation in video games about like games as a service or live service video games that come out like. Let's take, I guess, Destiny 2 as an example, right? Where it's constantly being iterated on. They're making new stuff for it. They come out with new seasons, things like that. But the issue is the base material, which is Destiny 2, is changing with it, right? It's constantly changing. So even if you buy Destiny 2, you're not worried about, oh shit, I just bought Destiny version 1.3 and everyone's playing on 2.2. I have to spend
all of my money on DLC, but I can still play Destiny.
Yeah, so, but that's not how it's going to work. That may be how it kind of works for people who play on D&D Beyond, if they really increase the service for that platform and really start turning out live updates with every little new thing. That's something. But if you bought the book, what do you do then? How do you fix those issues of you have various players who picked up one book and other players who picked up another book,
and I'll tell you what,
and they're all reading different material.
If you play Adventures League, like they're gonna immediately start like prioritizing the One D&D stuff over like old.
I guarantee you this is what's going to happen. For your point, Drew, what I think is going to happen is we're going to see a dip in quality in the print material because they're not going to want to invest in that because they know they're going to change. They're going to release errata. Maybe they'll even release books that are like, hey, updated material. Slot this in with your player's handbook, right? But I think they're going to really push for, like you said, that live service. They want people to use D&D Beyond. They wouldn't have acquired it if that wasn't the case, right? They want people to buy into D&D Beyond. Maybe they'll do the whole Game Pass thing where it's like, hey, you get a season's pass and this is the roadmap and you get all of these things when they come out. You get these maps, you get these dice.
Oh, we're gonna have phases like the MCU, One D&D phase.
We're gonna have the MCU, right? That's literally gonna be it, right? Because they'll want you to buy. They'll want you to buy that season pass. They'll turn it into like a subscription, right? So hey, you subscribe and you'll get all this stuff. Maybe there will be tiers.
It's very interesting if you look at something like World of Warcraft, which came out in 2004 when D&D 4th edition was around, and that was considered D&D 4th edition's like competition, and D&D 4th edition, a lot of people are like it's an MMO, stuff like that. Well, World of Warcraft is technically the same game, sort of, since 2004, just it's had a buttload of expansions, and now there's classic World of Warcraft. If we're going to have one D&D, well, one day we have classic one D&D, I don't know, or classic D&D, and it's just going to be back to 5th edition rules where you just get advantage for everything. Just imagine.
I think that, I mean, this is all speculation. I think the big factor in this is going to be the fact that they are going to push hard on this digital platform.
Yep.
Because in all of their messaging, the virtual tabletop is going to be a core component of One D&D, and so will D&D Beyond. What happens to all the folks who bought? Like, Drew, I know you bought like a whole bunch of that stuff, right, for D&D Beyond. What happens to all that stuff? Do you have to buy new stuff now? Do people who already have the player's handbook qualify for the One D&D one? Do they get that update? What happens to it's very, I think the closest analogy in video games would be, hey, what happened to the people who paid for the MMO and then it went free to play? Like, what happens if you have that original content and now you need to buy this new stuff?
And I understand from various perspectives, like this is similar to conversations that happen in any edition change. Well, what happened to the people who used to play 4th edition or 3rd edition or 3.5?
Fourth edition lives on in many ways.
Yeah.
But like I think like
I could
with
see people
any
playing. I could see
edition,
people doing 4th edition in the new VTT.
yeah, with any edition change, you're going to have some of those elements in conversation. But I think it's such a huge difference now with the fact that they're trying to, shove as much as it can towards D&D Beyond, and with the new VTT and all that kind of stuff. Like that does change the game in many ways, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think again, I think our big concern here is that it's going to turn into a game as a service. It will have an impact on print because you can't release DLC for print as easily. I mean, you can as like Unearthed Arcana, you just put it out online. But once that book is out, it's out.
Yeah.
But with
makes
D&D
some
Beyond,
things easier. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
you update it. My another thing that obviously, again, all speculation is, how are they going to monetize this? Are you going to have things in your character sheet that say like, oh, upgrade to One D&D? Are they going to like put microtransactions? It's not really going to be a microtransaction.
If I start seeing advertisements,
but they're going to put ads on it.
Beyond,
They're
I'm
guarantee you.
I
guarantee you.
There already kind of are microtransactions on D&D. You can buy different
these
dice.
Dice.
You can buy different bells and whistles. There are.
But they're going to put that in this now, though.
Well, you see interesting things like with the Vecna dossier that they put out when Stranger Things came out on D&D Beyond. You're going to see more and more exclusive content, and I think there'll probably be tiers to how this content is accessed in the future. Because I think
they might also just
that's what you do with the subscription service. I mean, that's
well, they'll need a roadmap, right? They'll need to get
yeah.
people to want to pay. Like I don't have Game Pass anymore because A, there are too many games to play, and B, like there's nothing that I want to play, right? So is it going to be, you buy the license and then you have it, or are you going to have to keep paying? Is it going to turn into like Steam where you just buy all these modules and you have all the maps and you launch them?
Probably not.
Is there going to be like a workshop? Is it going to be like a workshop where you have like Halo's Forge, like where you can make your own maps, but then you have a base game? Who knows what it's going to be? I am very interested to see what's going to happen with D&D Beyond, because I think the new One D&D Beyond, whatever the fuck they're going to call it, the One D&D Beyond is going to tell us a lot about the future of D&D and what they want. And I think as they're releasing material, obviously it's going to be important for us to read this stuff and critique it. But I think when they start showing us what the VTT will look like, that will be very telling of the consumer experience. Because we've talked a lot about the sort of gameplay experience and where they're kind of leaning, but the consumer experience is going to be something that we'll have to talk about as they release more information about D&D Beyond.
And I think it will be interesting to see if they manage to pull this off, the ripples that will happen in the industry.
Absolutely,
because I have it's hard to imagine, but if we do have like a Steam type situation, which I don't think will happen, but if we do have that will probably change the industry in general.
It would.
I will say. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, you go ahead. You go ahead.
So difficulties aside, I will say it will be nice. Should this really truly like become a game as a service or a live service game, it will be nice to like have errata and various updates and fixes just drop straight into D&D Beyond. I don't have to worry about anything, Yeah,
it's like your Steam update. It guarantee you there's going to be a day one update, day one patch. But
day one DLC.
Day one DLC. There's going to be a patch. They're going to have to fix these. They'll be like, oh, there was a mistake. And that's a cool thing that they can do. But again, it's all about how much is that going to cost the consumer? Is it going to be like Foundry so only one person has to have the Forge or whatever they want to call it, where you can make maps and then anyone else can participate in that campaign? Or does everyone else have to have the map feature? That's another question that I have. I think there is just all speculation, all questions. But one thing that I want, because I know Foundry does this, but I want to take it to the next level with D&D Beyond, is I would love for them to have shortcuts, because in Foundry you can shortcut your favorite like dice rolls, like your macros and stuff like that. What I would love is if you had, one of the with Level Up Gaming, the program I run for the autism community here, one of the biggest challenges with D&D Beyond is actually just the amount of information overload that you're presented with on your character sheet. There's all these different tabs and stuff. Here's what I think would be really neat for their VTT, or in general, just for D&D Beyond. I've told this to D&D Beyond. I'm saying it on stream too. I would really love for there to be multiple modes on a character sheet. I want combat mode, where the GM could be like, "Hey, this is my pitch." The GM
Hide
would be
your
like,
UI,
"Hey,"
basically. Yeah.
exactly. We're in combat. It hides the parts of the character sheet that are irrelevant to combat, and it becomes a minimalistic character sheet. So it's just like, here's my attacks, this is my equipment, these are my spells. I would also love if the player could hide aspects of their UI that are unimportant to them, or things that they find overwhelming. So for instance, if I don't have spells, I don't want to, like, I could just hide spells or anything related to spells. Or if I don't want to see my background and all that stuff, my notes, hide that. I also want a journal, right? I want all of that. But I want a customizable UI for the character sheets. If they're going to make this big virtual experience, I want the equivalent of remapping my controls.
Yeah. I mean, at this point,
and then sharing
am I an
your
expert in
loadout,
all of
like,
it?
I share my loadout.
At this point, am I an expert in all of it? No, but I think I've said it before. I'm on D&D Beyond every day. I am on D&D Beyond every day, whether it's for prep for games or I'm playing the game or things like that. So I know where things are and I know how to get to them. But even for me, who has thousands of hours in that thing at this point, I still have these moments in the middle of gameplay where I'm just like, where is this thing? Not because I don't know where it is, but because there's 1,000 options on the page to click on.
Yep.
It's not that I don't know where it is. It's that my eyes get ADHD lost in the sauce.
100%. 100%. Now, that said, we have gone way over time. I want to thank both of you for, and Michelle, who is not currently, who has left, but shout out to Michelle. I want to thank, all three of you for joining me for this conversation, because I honestly did not expect us to talk about games as a service. This is the most we've talked about video games on this podcast. And it was very relevant to the topic, because I think we're sort of dipping our toes into the same conversations that were had about 4th edition. So I, again, thank you, both of you, for joining me for this. And thank you to, we have, to shout out quite a few people, our patrons, for, their ongoing support. And it allows us to continue to produce Agents Represent, but also, use new tools like Riverside, which is what we're using right now. One thing I actually want to try doing in the future is actually having a patron-only stream, because one thing you can do with Riverside is you can actually have folks join in as audience members, and they can watch live without a delay, and they can also ask questions and actually call in.
You can give us inspiration.
Yeah, give us inspiration, or just call in. So that's something I want to try doing in the future. And I'll do it with more low stakes content, like our monthly sort of Bubble Tea Book Club, where I want to transition it to talking more about homebrew worlds. So I want to try doing that. But we have a lot of folks to thank for that. Our guardians, Jeremy, you are one of them. First of all, thank you so much. I appreciate your support. We have a lot of guardians. We have Brooke, Jeremy, we have Eyes and Daisy, we have Caroline, we have Kavi, we have Name X, Matt, Jay, who I was actually talking to today, Arjun, and Wayan. And of course, our most honorable patrons, our newest most honorable patron, Stefan, who was just on the podcast. Stefan is such a cool dude. I'm still that episode on blaxploitation films was just, it was eye-opening.
Great episode.
It was great, and there are a lot more topics I want to do, and Stefan is somebody who I want to lean on for his expertise. But also shout out to Bobsy, Michelle, Dungeon Glitch / Matt. Y'all are the most honorable. Metal Weave Games, Valorous Games as well. Shout out to Valorous Games. I know they have a stream going on right now, so make sure you folks check that out. But that said, thank you folks for joining us for this much longer stream. Jeremy, Drew, Michelle, wherever you may be, thank you for joining me. I look forward to us diving into, let's just do a whole episode on how we'd redo race. Basically, we're just going to do their jobs for them. How would we redo race? How would we redo feats? How would we redo backgrounds? What do you folks think? Do you think that would be a good follow-up episodes?
Oh, I think we got
so.
stuff to say.
Yeah,
I think
I think that would be fun, and I don't know when they're going to drop the next playtest package, but once they drop classes, then it's going to be a fun time.
We're gonna do a monk episode.
Well,
a monk episode.
I'm trying to see if they finally fix Rangers again for like the 5th time, but
Rangers can't get love.
Yeah.
This is basically, it's not Asians read 1D&D, it's Asians write. Asians fix 1D&D. That said, folks, thank you for joining us. Thank you to my amazing guests, and I look forward to us doing another follow-up to this. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.